Hello and welcome to episode number 20 of Performing Labor, and the final episode of 2020. My name is Rob Simons, and I am your host. This podcast features interviews with accomplished performing musicians who are doing interesting and creative work from within performing arts institutions and outside of them. We'll unpack their training, their practice, and their careers, how they got started, how they stay sharp, and their ambitions for the future. And it's my hope that these interviews will provide value no matter where you are on your musical journey. If you're thinking about a career in music, if you're in music school now, a working musician, or if you're a music lover and just curious to learn more. My guest this week is one of my absolute favorite musicians, guitarist and educator Craig Wagner from Louisville, Kentucky. In fact, the music that leads off this podcast and is playing underneath my introduction right now is his. I worked with Craig when I was still a member of the Louisville Orchestra. And as someone who's been drawn to guitar-centric music my whole listening life, I think he's basically a magician on the instrument. I've heard him play everything from contemporary classical music that pushes the outer limits of the instrument, to jazz, to rock, to soul, sometimes on the same set. Craig teaches at the University of Louisville and at his alma mater, Bellarmine University. And as a player, he's worked with a staggeringly wide spectrum of musicians and institutions. Far too many to list, but you know you're doing something right if you've played Lollapalooza and on MTV with Days of the New and the Walt Disney Concert Hall with the Los Angeles Philharmonic. Craig does this all with great humility and continued dedication to his craft. Something I've been thinking about since we spoke, though, was his observation about the guitar's somewhat under-theorized pedagogy, at least relative to some of the other instruments. There's even a tinge of frustration in his voice about some lost efficiency, that he could have gone even faster and further in his practicing and development, had that existed. In contrast, I've been thinking a lot about the negative effects that the highly theorized classical training has on players. There's very little of the tinkering and experimentation that Craig describes, and the relentless focus on a hollow definition of perfection, I think, is arguably having diminishing returns at this point on the art form and the business side of it. But at the end of the day, the technical level of classical players continues to rise, but the stagnation is still hard to ignore. And for anyone who's interested, this was addressed at length in the previous interview with Teddy Abrams. David Epstein's book, Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World, is worth reading on this point and paints a pretty unflattering picture of classical musicians' narrow path as compared with our jazz counterparts' winding one. In one of the many critiques of classical music's aggressive and accelerated specialization, he writes, quote, "Learning to play classical music is a narrative linchpin for the cult of the head start. It comes with a blueprint. Errors are immediately apparent. It requires repetitive practice of the exact same task until execution becomes automatic and deviation is minimal." Even when Epstein's points don't entirely land squarely, they still sting because they're laced with truth. So it was interesting to hear someone with Craig's command of his instrument looking in on that with envy, and how he connects that towards the end of the conversation with contemporary composers and players who increasingly see a musical continuum rather than isolated and distinct styles. That outlook creates opportunities for a wider range of instrumentalists to participate, to both learn in and contribute to institutional music making, and to growing audiences and sparking innovation through collaboration. Please enjoy this interview with Craig Wagner. Craig Wagner, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks for having me.
So I think of you as like Mr. Versatility. If there's something cool happening in Louisville that needs a guitar player, you're probably on the gig. I mean, we met with you playing like the gnarliest guitar solo in the Louisville Orchestra that I've ever heard. Teddy Abrams' piece.
Right. Oh my God. Yeah.
I mean, so that was a pretty big introduction to you as a player. But I think at your core, you're a jazz guitarist. I'm curious to hear about how you found your way to that music when you were a kid. I mean, was it love at first sight?
I mean, it was a progression, I think. I'd always been into improvising, so I was definitely drawn to it from that, even if I didn't know what I was kind of leaning towards ultimately was this music, commonly called jazz. I started off not unlike pretty much every teenager that picks up a guitar, and I was playing like metal and punk rock and playing music that was kind of contemporary to me. And, went back to a generation or two before me and checked out, the real formative rock and blues rock guitar that of, all the great stylists who had come before, certainly, Hendrix and Jeff Beck and people of that ilk. But also, really the first thing that piqued my interest about the instrument was seeing Doc and Merle Watson play at what would that have been, 1984? I don't know. I can't remember exactly the year, but it was at when they had the Kentucky Bluegrass Festival. It used to be a thing. It was just a great bluegrass festival. I mean, Sam Bush, Bill Monroe was there, Bela in his early days before even he was Bela. It was like the Newgrass Revival with Sam Bush and John Cowan and all those greats. And, Tony Rice would be playing. These were people I had no idea who they were. I just knew I loved the music. And my sister happened to work for Kentucky Fried Chicken, like the place off the highway where their administration offices were. So she had some sort of staff job there. Since they sponsored the event, I got to go backstage, and I was probably 13 years old or something, and there's just this old blind man sitting back there in the stage waiting to go back on behind stage with what I assumed was his son, who was playing slide guitar. And I came to know that was Doc, the famous Doc Watson, and Merle Watson, his son. And it was tragically one of his final performances. He tragically died like a couple weeks after that. And that's where Merle Fest, for those bluegrass fans out there, that's where that comes from. It's in honor of Merle Watson, Doc's son. And that was like really an awakening for me in terms of, man, I want to do that. I had no musical upbringing at all, no music in my family or anything. So it was basically that experience, and then kind of a hoodlum 8th grade friend of mine who introduced me to Eddie, man, Eddie Van Halen and all of that kind of stuff. And so from there, probably my first 2 albums that I bought were, my very first one was Synchronicity by the Police, and Andy Summers blew me away. I still love his playing and how he used the guitar in that setting. And then Thriller, of course, as everyone did that year, bought that album. And Moving Pictures by Rush. I think those were my first 3 actual albums I bought with my own money at Target.
I'm curious then, so you've got that kind of the shredders in your lineage. Did you at the same time then combine some of the right hand technique that you were seeing by those bluegrass players? Did those things come together at the same time? Because you're known for, amazing right hand technique.
Well, yeah, and the frustrating thing for me is it always felt I wasn't really ever a schooled player in any way. And, guitars, we can get into that because guitar is so lacking in any pedagogy that so many other instruments that you run across in terms of, especially in orchestras, would have, and if it does have a pedagogy, it has such a twisted path because in terms of the right hand, more so than the left hand technique, assuming you play in the traditional manner, there's so many different ways to approach it. But yeah, that stamp of that sound, that aggressive flat pick, really punchy sound, has always been stuck in my ear as the sound of what a guitar should sound like, especially an acoustic instrument. And it should have that drive, and it should have that clarity, and it should have that precision, but also a little bit of that dirt and that grittiness that's kind of part of that too, where you kind of overdrive the string a little. So I always had maybe a tonal palette that was really influenced by bluegrass, and what attracted me later to earlier jazz, such as Django Reinhardt. I heard similar things in his playing from the tonal point of view, and it makes sense to me why there's a sort of a lot of cross-pollination between the bluegrass players and sort of the Hot Club of France kind of Grappelli, Django kind of type of music, that style. Because it has a similar, I think, acoustic aesthetic, and there's no drums, and the guitar is really and in bluegrass, the mandolin and the guitar really, or the engine, the driving force behind it, where the drums wouldn't be. So yeah, that always really influenced me in terms of the sound. And so there was that always on one side of the fence, and then there was like this whole electric guitar kind of thing on the other side that was, trying to elbow its way in there too. And I mean, still to this day, those two are always kind of, it's like the angel and devil on my shoulder. It's trying to vie for attention, because they both require a completely different touch. So I had to learn that. And, I started off as just out of necessity as a pick player, playing with a, traditional flat pick, that kind of style. But I was always more comfortable, playing with my fingers more, not really in what you'd call a classical guitar style, but more of a hybridized banjo kind of technique, using thumb and my index and middle finger. And so I eventually gave up playing with a pick and tried to do those similar kind of things that I would do in what would be called fingerstyle guitar. But I tried to apply them to, the kind of flat picking, the single line solos that you associate with both rock guitar and in maybe bluegrass and the Hot Club of France, Django Reinhardt sort of styles, and just jazz in general, which was, I guess, a little uncommon and always raised a few eyebrows when I'd go to jam sessions and jazz and I'd get out my banjo pick. It's like, you want to play, Craig? Like, sure. I'd get my thumb pick on and my two banjo picks. Like,
So,
oh my God.
Craig, is that unique to you then, that technique with using the finger picks?
I mean, there's certainly been jazz players, Lenny Breau, one of my favorites, who played with a thumb and an index finger. No one really used the banjo picks to my memory, but certain blues players certainly did. Muddy Waters did, used it.
Were you learning, was there a point at which these worlds completely overlapped, where you were like learning with high fidelity every nuance of an Eddie Van Halen guitar solo and trying to do it with the finger picking right hand, or did you keep those two worlds separate?
Yeah, I mean, that's dead on. I mean, that's what I try to do. And I knew, and at least what little I did know, I did at least know enough that you kind of have to go all in on one thing, and there's, an immersion period with practicing. And fortunately or unfortunately, I was always pretty obsessive about those things. So I had no time putting the hours in, I guess, but it was a matter of making sure those hours were focused enough. Again, with something like that, I didn't really have any teachers to guide me in that way. I mean, I did go to music school eventually, but it was more of a traditional kind of music school approach. It wasn't really, teaching me about the technique, and that was still kind of left up to the personal choice of the student a lot of times, as it still is often in jazz. So yeah, I would try, if I learned a Wes Montgomery solo or a Pat Martino solo or a George Benson solo, I'd just kind of learn to play it in my own way and filter it through my own way of playing.
I want to go back a little bit to the idea of there not being a great deal of pedagogy, because obviously as a classical violinist, I come from just very defined schools, right? But I think it's such a limiting force too. So even you bring out somebody like Wes Montgomery with that crazy thumb technique, right? That produces such a unique sound that he obviously devised, to meet the technique to the sound he heard in his head. That wouldn't have been possible really with if he had like strict guitar lessons in Indianapolis,
right?
That's
totally true.
So I'm curious though, as a kid, so before music school, you said that improvisation was creeping into your playing. The last person I talked to was our mutual friend and collaborator, Teddy Abrams, and he talked about how
awesome.
He defined improvisation. I thought this was a really fantastic way of thinking about it, but as a generative force for composition. So he made the analogy: talking is to writing what improvisation is to composing. And I just wonder, like, as a creative person and also as a composer yourself, how did improvisation become a part of your early practice?
I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, I remember, similar to what Teddy said, Wayne Shorter had this great quote about the two. He's known, of course, for his great improvisations, but also his writing, very unique writing style. But he just said, composition is improvisation slowed down and improvisation is composition sped up. He looked at it as the same continuum. There's still themes, there's still motivic development in the best soloist. Now certainly some soloists, if you're improvising, it's maybe a recitation of memorized licks, which I wouldn't really call improvisation. It's kind of pre-planned. There's certainly elements that come into that, and I think everyone starts that way. They learn their blues licks and they know where to put them, and then they kind of expand their vocabulary a little. And I certainly wasn't any different in that regard. But once you start getting into it more, and the people that really master the art of it, and especially the pacing and the phrasing of it, which is, it's not just kind of going off for 32 bars or 64 bars or just even 16 bars or whatever. They're using the form as a composer would as part of an improvisational ally. It's like, okay, I'm going to take two choruses here. It's like, okay, I know how to pace this, and I know where the climactic part of my solo is going to be. We mentioned Wes Montgomery, earlier, and it doesn't matter all his solos have this narrative arc to them. He always starts really lyrical, single strings in the lower register. He builds back, he puts it in second gear, third gear. He's in, playing these double time bebop lines. Then he goes into playing these great bebop lines with octaves, bigger, and then he goes into these big chordal punctuations, not unlike a big shout chorus of a big band. And then he kind of trails off. Almost all of his solos have this great narrative arc. Sonny Rollins, Jim Hall, Bill Frisell, other great lyrical players, that have such amazing ideas, and you realize quickly, if you're really serious about it, it's so much more about playing fast and hot licks and everything. And you're really trying to say something extemporaneously. And you realize you have to deal with lyricism and phrasing, like I mentioned, and you have to deal with form, and you have to deal with not just the what of it, but the when and the how, and sometimes the why. So all the greatest improvisers, I think, have this internal editor in their, just like some cigar chomping, newspaper. Why'd you write that? This is needless. But they're doing that like all on the fly. It's like, yeah, I could go for the hit lick right here and go, or I could do the artistic thing and not do that, and, there's always that temptation of flashover content. There's so much dedication that gets to the point of the control, the virtuosity, whatever you want to call it, to be able to do those things, and then to deliberately not use the things you've practiced, and do the best idea should win, and doing all of that kind of in a nanosecond. That's just so challenging. I think that part of it is what always drew me to it. Even if it was something, more simple, like how I started playing. At least harmonically or stylistically simple. That sounds like a judgment word. I don't really mean that, because even doing that stuff well is there's such nuance to everything that, shouldn't be throwing out terms like sophisticated, or I just lack the language for it. You know what I mean? So for me, that definitely started from more of the improvised acoustic music kind of stuff. I hesitate to call what I did bluegrass, because I would not, although I've always loved it, I wouldn't consider myself in that style or immerse myself in that style as much as I love it, as much as I did maybe jazz. And so I always kind of approached that music more from maybe a jazz player who was a huge bluegrass fan, coming through that lens, that was kind of my in to that music. But it just always fascinated me, trying to get those two skill levels together, things where you work on prepared music and you get the technique together to master that, but then you have to go beyond that with playing improvised music to some extent. And you're just out there on your own, and you're trying to make it cohesive, and you're just trying not to make it some big shock and awe moment.
I think of my own listening and reflected in what you were just talking about, that there is in a lot of like the great rock guitarists, metal guitarists, there is like the kitchen sink quality to their playing. But
yeah,
and maybe the contrast over, so let's say like more simple harmonic structures, like some of those blues players maybe would fit into the category of people that pace their solos. I'm thinking like the Stevie Ray Vaughan or somebody like that. But maybe even somebody, I don't know how you feel about his playing, but like I think of somebody like maybe like a Slash, who's takes like a blues approach. And I always thought, even as a kid, I remember thinking, well, this is a really paced melodic idea.
Yeah. I mean, and some of those guys too would take great rock players who I admire, like, David Gilmour, I love it. Like all David Gilmour solos, those solos kind of became iconic, and he has to play them live, at least reference them. His approach to coming up with those solos, because say the Beatles, George Harrison would write a solo, like the solo to something, or any of those great guitar solos in there were very thought out. Dave Gilmour would get to those points through improvisation. He would do, okay, let's, say there's 16 bars, and he would do one pass, and then he would keep that take, and then he'd do a second pass. He might do 6 passes over that same thing, and he'd snatch phrases from each one. He'd have all his settings the same, and he just one after the other, and he'd go in there and lay down all these different solos, and he'd take phrase from here, phrase from here, phrase from here, and put it in, all, then bounce it to one mix, and then he'd learn that, as
wait, this is George Harrison?
No, this was David Gilmour.
Sorry.
So you get to that point, like, I know I mentioned George Harrison, but George Harrison would like write, like those solos he did were so like iconic and part of the songs, I was talking about like the solo, especially on Something, just all those great little things that he would do in there. You can edit that out, hopefully.
No, it's going in.
Philip Bailey, I am not in my falsetto. I'm sorry. The thing about David Gilmour getting to that point was he would get there through improvisation. He'd have a compositional element, and I think a lot of composers probably in different ways approach it that way. I mean, I know we're talking about like rock music there, pop music, but he had definitely a very melodic style, that kind of soared above everything. And all the solos, just like you were mentioning with Slash, or maybe someone like Joe Walsh, who I think is actually criminally overlooked as a great rock guitar player and a great phraser, and someone with just like such a deep, swampy pocket in his playing that's really overlooked, even going back to like the James Gang and all that stuff he did. Those players in particular would always seem to honor melody over flash, than maybe some of their contemporaries would kind of overlook, which is kind of easy to understand given the format and the setting some of that stuff's in. If you're playing a gig and you're playing with Ozzy Osbourne, maybe subtlety is not first on the docket there, but it's sometimes you just the hammer's got to fall, and it's when I was
a kid, I remember listening to it, or I think it was listening to, because I can hear his voice in my head. So an interview with Joe Walsh, and he talked about how his education in learning the guitar was learning every nuance of every note on every Beatles record. And I remember thinking at the time, I wasn't a huge Beatles fan. I listened to a lot of classic rock as a kid, more in the background than really engaged with it. But I listened to a lot of classic rock on the radio. And I just wasn't a big Beatles guy. And that changed me to go back and listen with more intent. But I also thought as a young violin student, what is the equivalent in my repertoire of Beatles catalog? And I thought it was maybe the Beethoven string quartets. So going back and like really understanding that, even because I didn't have the opportunity to play them all like before I got to college. Well, quite frankly, I haven't played them all at this point in my career, but having gone through with them, played along with recordings, and really understanding that. So that I've always felt like I owe Joe Walsh a debt of gratitude for that. I'm curious about when the more formal theory though of jazz, like the more sophisticated cerebral part of this stuff, started working its way into your education, either on your own or in school.
I basically did all of what I was saying through my teenage years, and comes time for college, and I just decided to major in music. You're a guitar player. You basically have, 2 choices, and it's classical guitar or jazz guitar. And I certainly didn't have the background at that point to go into classical guitar, nor did I have own one of those. So it's kind of an easy decision to be made just out of out of the lack of resources there. So I majored in jazz. I went to Bellarmine College just in Louisville. And they were actually, before U of L, they actually were the ones in the state where you could actually get a jazz performance degree. Even before the program where I teach now at U of L, before that was like kind of solidified. I mean, you could certainly study jazz there, but you couldn't make that your major. I would have had to have studied classical guitar, and then I could have done it some on the side, maybe secondary lessons or done some ensembles. But at the time, you couldn't major in that. And it wasn't that I was disinterested in doing classical guitar at all. I was always loved that. I was always a huge fan of John Williams and Christopher Parkening and everything. And then, you know, the flamenco side of that was a very big draw to me, although it's not exactly classical guitar, but certainly like Paco de Lucia and people like that, you know, Paco Peña were huge influences on me sonically, if not stylistically, you know, just the sound, the aggression they kind of played with, you know, the fire. So, but you know, it was just a jazz program, and I had never read music at that point, and that was a slow process for me coming up in that situation, you know, always being an ear player about everything. I just figured things out by ear. So that was probably the biggest thing that I got out of being in college, was just being forced to do that in ensembles, being in one of the first guitar chairs in like those ensembles, playing these five guitar pieces. A guy named Jeff Sherman was my teacher there, who was a great teacher, and introduced me to all that, and got familiar with a lot of the jazz players, such as, you know, Jim Hall and especially Jimmy Rainey, who was a huge influence on me, and who was from Louisville, and, you know, had kind of famously played in Stan Getz's band, and had played with Dizzy and Charlie Parker, and played with Billie Holiday, and then had come back to Louisville, and he along with maybe one or two other people in the history of jazz guitar were kind of considered the first ones to really play modern jazz guitar, you know, take the language that Dizzy and Charlie Parker had been doing and put it on guitar. And he was just here, you know, he just happened to be, I didn't really appreciate to the fact how heavy that fact was, and how, you know, internationally renowned he was. I mean, or as my wife says, what, is he famous or is he jazz famous? You know, he was jazz famous, but, you know, I mean, big time jazz famous as far as the history of guitar goes. And really him and a guy named Tal Farlow, two Southern boys, you know, I think Tal was from, if I'm not mistaken, North Carolina, were the ones that kind of put that on, really that language on the guitar with that kind of fluency and that double time and that chromatic, you know, highly virtuosic jazz language. And he was right there. He was Jeff, my guitar teacher. He had been Jeff's guitar teacher. And he taught these clinics at Bellarmine every year. Jimmy was around. I would go completely underage to these places he was playing, and they'd let me just sip a Coke and stay in the corner. And I'd watch him play with another kind of local hero of mine named Scott Henderson, who just passed away a couple years ago, but he had also been a student of Jimmy's. And you know, through that kind of influence, and the influence of Jimmy Rainey, and just getting to interact with him and talk to him, I mean, because he's a brilliant guy. You know, I mean, you could have a 2-hour conversation with him. The subject of music might not even come up. You know, he'd be talking about abstract expressionism, or he'd be talking about physics, you know, or, you know, just name the subject. He was one of those kind of guys. Just the timing of that was a huge part of my college experience, you know, and I think it would have been something way different if Jimmy Rainey had not been there. I definitely took advantage of those resources.
Taking advantage of those resources, though, sounds like it's a lot of kind of the informal education, like just going to watching these guys play. I mean, is a big part of the jazz education like the early professional side, like just playing the tunes over and over again? I mean, you probably don't leave school fully formed.
No, you don't. I mean, I certainly didn't. And I didn't really feel like I was really getting a clue into how to approach the music till it was really time to put my senior recital together, honestly. Yeah, so much of it, I mean, if I remember anything, just being in Jeff's office and like getting my little remember those little clear cassettes you get. That's like, and I would just dub all of he had tons of LPs always there, and this is stuff that's still hard to find. And I would just sit there, and he had the LP player with the little cassette, the double cassette thing underneath that, and I would just rip all these albums, off. So I had them, and I'd label them, and I'd put handwrite all the liner notes. I mean, not all the liner notes, but like the personnel, any pertinent stuff about that. I transcribed a lot of that stuff. I would certainly with the guitar parts of it, that's what I would do. That's a huge part of your education, I think, early on as an improvising musician, whether it's jazz or anything else, is you just learn the solos. You want to learn how to talk a language, you have to learn by imitation at first. So you learn to imitate. It's Clark Terry, I'm paraphrasing, but you imitate, perspirate, innovate. It's like you steal other people's stuff, then you do the work, and then you finally come as a culmination of all those things, you come up with your own thing, but that innovation isn't going to you're finding your own voice is not going to happen without those prior processes already being in place. So that was a big part of it. I mean, that is pretty informal. I mean, what I remember about it most, I'd have weekly guitar lessons, and I'd try to be a big overachiever in that regard and try to go way above and beyond. If I was supposed to learn something, I'd learn 5 things. If I'm supposed to learn, a chorus of someone's solo, I'd memorize the entire solo, that kind of stuff. Still the reading, though, he always got me on that. I was not a great reader coming out of college. It's a common thing with a lot of guitar players. But that was something after college that I, tried to devote my time to develop.
So you've got this crazy winding path to this point in your life. How do you structure this for your kids now that you're a professor of the instrument and of jazz? I mean, do you try and institutionalize this for your incoming kids, like to make sure that they're reading from day one, that they're listening to, they know the right solos?
I definitely try to do that. So because, as we mentioned earlier, there's such a lack of pedagogy on this instrument, which in some ways I'm completely envious of with other instruments, because sometimes there's 300-400 years of of work already done, of sports science, so to speak, about the technique of that instrument that's so well founded, and all the stuff that is a waste of time is in terms of technique has been filtered out. Total efficiency. Guitar does not enjoy that kind of position, and so since there's so many approaches to the instrument, especially in the jazz way and the non-classical guitar kind of styles, it mainly comes down to the right hand. So very early on, I don't push them to play like me because it's a strange way to play, but I encourage them, through our lessons to find what they're doing best about their right hand technique, and I try to guide them as far as what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong, what they could do better, what could be more efficient. Because there's maybe not a pedagogy there, but there are maybe 5 pretty much acceptable ways of picking. In terms of how you use your wrist, how you use your fingers, how you hold the pick, things like that. Seeing if they're double jointed or not, where their thumb is, how they strike the string, the angle at which they strike the string, all those kind of things. So I try to help them with that, with what they already do, and try to refine that. If they're not already doing something, then, I kind of can mold them a little more towards something that I think is maybe better, in my humble opinion. But, I try not to too much push them in a certain direction technically, as far as what, because I feel that's still kind of a personal thing about a guitar player, as far as the way they actually play in terms of the right hand technique. But I certainly try to avoid things that I did. It maybe is a disingenuous way of teaching, because I'm teaching maybe in the way that I wish I'd been taught, rather because it wasn't the way I learned. maybe the way I learned is, who knows, maybe that's better, that to have this super windy path. It certainly was not a straight one.
Do you sense, Craig, that younger generations of aspiring jazz students and jazz musicians, are they a little bit farther along than you were with this music at that age? I mean, I feel that way as a violinist. I mean, I feel like each
Yeah,
generation is a little bit more sophisticated.
oh yeah, I think there's a certain awareness, there on just how more accessible the music is. I mean, certainly the technological elements. I think they're maybe more educated in that way.
Hmm.
Technically, I wouldn't necessarily say so. I mean, it's just a hard instrument to play, and I think they all come in with their certain deficiencies and their certain strengths, and they're not always the same ones.
Hmm.
Certainly, like everyone does, but it's definitely the accessibility to the repertoire and the famous recordings is, there's no excuse for not having that anymore. But what I will say as a critique, it seems like as the accessibility increases to all of these resources, the fire in the belly to go seek them out, even though they're just right there at a fingertip, seems to diminish.
I wonder if in the aggregate, though, they're still hearing more. Like I remember my freshman, sophomore year early, I lived in what we called the listening lab in conservatory. Like I would
Yeah.
go and check records out of the thing and sit there and listen in the thing. And yes, there was something intentional about doing that. And when a CD cost like 19 bucks in 1995, like it was kind of prohibitive. But yeah, so I agree. I think now, like if I were 19 years old, how much would I be consuming? How much more would I know? I think that my impression is that most kids are, even if they're not taking full advantage of it, they're absorbing all that's out there.
There's like kind of the background of them absorbing it, but I still think one can only do so much immersive listening, because and I don't see maybe that being any more possible with what our technology is today. I mean, we still have the same brain, same aware. It's not like we're data from Star Trek to the Next Generation. You can listen to 101 different recordings at the same time on a critical level. I would love that, but what I fear, is like listening to 10,000 things one time, or listening to one thing 10,000 times. I'm in the latter camp. And I remember one student saying, back when iTunes was actually a thing, what is even it in Apple Music now? But this was years ago, but he said, man, imagine if Bird had an iPod, like iTunes. The Bird meaning Charlie Parker, that was his nickname. And I was like, man, I don't know. I mean, he probably owned 5 records, man, and he like memorized every single thing on them, and then found his own way to his path there. And I think in some ways, there's only so much time in the day, and it's not that it's not great to listen to the music for, of course, the enjoyment of it, but it's when I'm listening to it, I either want it silent, or I want to be listening to something like I'm watching a film, or like I'm reading a novel. It's not like if I have just music on in the background, I'm not like one of those people. Like I don't like turn on music while I'm doing my laundry, or like if I'm washing the dishes, or I think you kind of have to curate that time very wisely, and it's hard to do as a young person, but you just kind of keep your own counsel and follow the thing. I mean, all I did was follow the things that just really turned me on in terms of my ear, and I would just, wow, that just knocked me out. I don't know what it is or even how to describe it, but that was the first time I heard like Coltrane. It was Alabama, that piece, and it's on the Smithsonian record. I remember I had this teacher that in high school that had played us the whole Smithsonian collection of jazz during we had a humanities class, of all things, which was rare to have at such a school. And man, Alabama and Lonely Woman by Ornette Coleman, those just totally blew me away. And at that time, this was before college, and I was still playing like metal and punk rock and like indie bands, and but that's something about that. I mean, it still had that power that music that I'd been playing did, but this level of harmonic sophistication and rhythmic freedom that I'd never really encountered in those types of music, that type of music either. So, and I didn't know how to define that, or, Ornette Coleman's whole harmonic system, or whether it was free jazz and what that really meant, or what Coltrane was building all of his, bitonal kind of improvisational techniques against
Hmm.
pedal points. What I didn't, I just knew that I had no language even at that time. Remember, I couldn't even read. So it was like, I mean, I knew the names of the notes, but it was like, I didn't have any kind of theory training or anything like that. And but it still struck me, even though that wasn't anything in my wheelhouse as far as playing had been, up to that point. So I think just those kind of things were pivotal moments for me, because I just kind of followed my own ear into things that were just super intriguing and fascinating to me, and that would bear up against repeated listenings. And so that's what I mean. Like, I would, the whole thing about listening to one thing 10,000 times, or,
Hmm.
10,000 things once. And I feel that sometimes that's a danger with students these days on the jazz side of things. I don't know if it's the same with classical students.
I wonder if the analogy or a way to think about it is, my sense is that the benefit of the access is
Mm-hmm.
awareness of so many different kinds of
Oh yeah.
playing, versus the going a mile deep with a particular tradition. I mean, I come out of a very specific tradition in the violin, and to me, it's the best one. Like, I think it's like the great practitioners of this style are the
Right.
masters of the instrument in my
Right.
estimation. But I can also see, like, it is such a constrained way of thinking about it. So I absolutely hear you, in terms of maybe there's a lack of depth of knowledge about things, but I think there is a trade-off in just that people are so
That's
aware
right.
of so many different styles. I wonder how the pandemic though has affected your teaching. So what has the technology brought any surprises and assets to pedagogy?
Yes. I think, I mean, as everyone knows, everyone, if you're teaching online, you're doing the Zoom thing, much like we're doing this interview over. It's That's challenging in some ways. It's actually not that bad, except the casualty of that whole experience is that, from a jazz perspective, we can't actually play together in real time. There's always that 30, 60 millisecond delay, depending,
Hmm.
so you're never in time. That I really miss, because that it's so much of it is about the time feel. There's a lot of other things we can make up for it in private lessons when I do it in the virtual realm. What I think has been a benefit, so that's one, I would say, casualty of that experience of, like, not having an in-person private lesson, where we're just playing tunes and we're,
Hmm.
just interacting. I mean, because that's the nature of that music. It's the nature of all music, really. I mean, it's a hearing art. So, but we're reacting to each other in real time, and they're learning to do that, and they're learning to respond to me, and they hear me respond to them. Um, but the fact that, like, some of the ensembles too have been in a virtual setting has been eye-opening in some ways, because what would normally have been, a regular jazz ensemble, in this case, it was a more guitar-led ensemble. Sometimes I have a guitar ensemble where we'd have literally like 5 guitar players, but we treat it like kind of a mini big band. Now that, some students couldn't return, we didn't have a full complement of players, so some play since we're forced to do it online, we're doing it it's a recording ensemble kind of. So I would send out kind of a master track that might be a click track. I might have a bass line that I laid down on it. I might have the lead part on there, something, as a guide track through there. Sometimes it was only the click track, and we would build the arrangement on up from there. Kind of old school. The bass and drums would lay their parts down first. The guitars would we'd lay rhythm section down, and then layers on top of that. It depended on the piece, but it was a great learning experience for them, for me too, but for them, uh, in terms of really putting the microscope on their playing and things, even if we're playing live, when they're just kind of in survival mode of trying to get through the chart and play it, there may be some artistic decisions that they're overlooking, and nuances they're missing, because they are just still kind of new to it and they're trying to just get through it. Don't mess up. Being in that mindset. Some of them are still there. So having the luxury of the time to actually get the part right that they were laying down, and then to be very critical about hearing yourself recorded. They're very new to that side of things. And the red light itis part of it, of actually being documented forever, in some sort of way, and what that teaches them every time they hit that red button on their laptop of trying, even though of course they can take multiple takes and everything. There's a certain part of performance that you actually learn, I think, from recording that is way more fine detailed than maybe the process would be live, at least as kind of a learning lab for such things.
Sure. So pre-pandemic, was recording yourself as a part of practicing not really a part of the jazz tradition?
Oh, it's definitely a part of it, but it's maybe not, in such hyper detail. What will and jazz players and professionals too, are rapidly record like every performance they have, and of course fast forward through everyone's solos and listen to after the performance, listen to how did I sound. It's just that form of self-critique, because none of it's none of the music's written down, and you're not just listening to your performance, you're listening to your phrasing, how your time feel is, how you play with this drummer, how you play with that bass player, all the different things, because it's always so wildly different with every performance.
The flip side of this, of course, though, is from my world, Craig, where we record ourselves with that fine-tooth comb, but then we can't play with other people because our playing is so set up. Because particularly for orchestral musicians, you spend a lot of years preparing for that 5-minute, 10-minute audition. And you make sure that every piece of that thing is put together. Back in my day, we had little gadgets that would slow things down to half speed, so you could really pull that. And now you can just do it all on your computer. But we'd have to go. I had this whole arsenal of recording equipment to.
Oh, the Marantz! I used to have the Marantz that would slow things down
to give different perspective. But the difference is, of course, we didn't spend as much time recording ensembles. We recorded recitals and things, but I think with a different ear to that. One thing I thought was interesting, though, that what you're saying is a guest I had a while back is also teaching at university and was talking about how you can do the lesson via Zoom, but you can't do it really in real time. So he's been recording lessons, and then they watch them together, like watch the recording, or they record the performance. And that actually, so yes, you get some red light itis, as you said, but it actually takes some of the pressure dynamic out of the lesson, and you maybe get like a bit of a more accurate representation of where your playing really is. Because I don't know about you, man, but I remember going into lessons each week and thinking, all right, this week I'm going to really blow my teacher's socks off and like crumble like a house of cards. So I think that's an innovation that actually might continue forward. This is a little off topic, but I was thinking as you were talking, I read many fewer guitars are selling like year over year. And there's almost like the guitar is becoming like an older instrument in some ways. Like it's almost like more like becoming more of the violin than it is like a young person's instrument. And are the great guitar heroes that inspired you as a kid, are they being regenerated? Are there, when Eddie Van Halen died a couple months ago, that kind of hit me kind of hard, actually. Like it was a big part of my childhood, and I went back and listened to a lot of his records, actually, and I haven't listened to a Van Halen record closely in a long time. And I was like legitimately blown away again by how like subtle and swingy his playing was. But without that regenerative new players, so like who's the Eric Clapton, who's the Pat Metheny, who is the Eddie Van Halen for like younger kids, are the kids coming into school now, are they kind of speaking the same language that you did? Does that make sense? Like, is there a stagnation in the instrument a little bit?
I don't think so. There's certainly, think in the more the blues or the blues rock kind of realm, you have players like Derek Trucks, who are, just so phenomenal and have such a singular voice, so I think it's in great hands in that way. And certainly there's like a whole scene that I'm not as much tapped into, but in the kind of the prog rock, prog metal, or, you know, whatever people are calling it,
Mm-hmm.
kind of vein where there's like amazing virtuosic players doing some, you know, pretty exciting things on the instrument. And certainly in jazz, there's been I don't think any lack of innovation in that regard either. I think it's just kind of a natural ebb and flow as part of you know, popular music gets more to being a producer's craft than a musician's craft
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of ways. A lot of times, you know, it's more about it's maybe in the Ableton Logic realm that it is actually performed in a lot of ways, you know, built from, and that's not like making a value judgment about that at all, because there's a lot of great stuff you can do in the electronic medium without like touching an acoustic instrument. But any instrument that's an acoustic instrument kind of has its heyday, or has its, you know, it's not like the saxophone went away, but that was like the big thing
Mm-hmm.
back in the, you know, the swing era, and everything, and it's still there. Actually, during the pandemic times, it's actually, they've been flying off the shelves probably
Yeah,
for
no,
like,
I've seen that. I've seen that people have been really picking up, and that's really
I mean, I
encouraging.
think that's just for the hobbyist kind of,
Yeah,
you
but I
know,
think, but
have the
where there are
time to do.
hobbyists, where there's interest is there, where there is interest, you know, and that there
Yeah.
is, and it's not that I was worried about the instrument going away. It's more that
Oh
it
yeah.
kind of gets repeating itself, and I see
Yeah.
that a lot in my
Like, and that's
side
what
of
I
the
mean,
industry.
like yeah, the stagnation part of it. I don't get too much worried about that, and I see so much innovation in there, you know, in the world of this instrument, that I'm not really worried about that. I mean, it's not the stuff that maybe rises to the surface of public consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
but, and back to what my wife says, it's like, is it famous or is it jazz famous? You know, it's jazz famous stuff, and kind of nerdy jazz
Mm-hmm.
famous, so it's even a more narrow contingent of listeners. But I think it's in pretty good hands.
Well, so that's great news. So speaking of kind of what you're hearing and what bubbles to the surface for you, tell me about like your life in the Louisville music scene. Like, what is like your working playing life like?
Before all this, I was quite fortunate to just be doing the music I really wanted to do. You know, I was getting to play jazz. I was getting to play my own music. I was getting to really work on my solo and duo kind of guitar chops. You know, with a great singer here locally, whose band I'm in as well, is Carly Johnson. And she just released her record, kind of soul pop stuff, really fun. But the most of what we did was, you know, jazz standards, duo, just guitar and voice, which has been great. And we've, you know, probably done that for over a decade and done all kinds of different things, played at all different kinds of festivals and stuff with that. So that's been a big part of it. It's really helped me develop as a solo player. I mean, because in a sense, even when the voice is there, you're still the kind of whole harmonic and rhythmic engine of the group, and without a bass player, without a drummer there. So it forced me over the years to, I mean, I always worked on my solo guitar playing, but there's a lot of times more maybe arrangements, kind of thought out things to do, walking bass lines, comping, you know, playing melodies, that kind of stuff.
Can I interrupt you for a second on
Yeah,
that? Can you
yeah.
tell me about the instrument you play on those solo arrangements you do? When you have that 7-string guitar?
Yeah, so it's yeah, and I went to that some years ago, where, and it's not that uncommon, I guess, in jazz styles, especially in the solo guitar world, where they'll add an extra. It's on the low register typically, and that's what mine is. It's a lower string. It's a fifth below my lowest E string, which most people play guitar know your lowest string. The fat one is the low E. So I have an A below that low E, which mirrors the fifth string that's right above that A, right above that E. So it's kind of like an A on my low 3 strings. And doesn't make much sense in terms of, you know, because guitar's usually tuned in fourths because it's such a long scale length, you know, instead of tuned in fifths like a violin or something, or a mandolin. But that extra fifth gives you quite a lot more range on the low end to support the harmony. Because you know, a lot of times you'll be playing. It doesn't matter if you're playing with when you're playing with a band, because there's a bass player there. But if you're playing solo and you have, you know, E flat's a really common key in jazz, say for example, and my lowest E flat root note is my, first fret of my fourth string. That's kind of wimpy sounding bass note. It's not very low. So now, I can go an octave below that, and it can be, and then I have a fifth even below that. I can, so it's kind of nice. And it's, that comes from a great jazz guitarist named George Van Epps, who kind of pioneered that style of solo playing and had that tuning. Although he tuned his whole guitar even lower, relative to itself, he tuned it down like a whole step often. But it was that same kind of thing where he added a lower string. I think he had the company Gretsch make him a guitar. And so that became kind of a common, I will say not a completely uncommon thing in jazz guitar to have the seven string.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and it's always been a thing in Brazilian music. It's been fairly common on, especially in choro music. They would have 7-string guitars, and they would be more like what we call classical guitar, non-string guitar. It's not played as such, but they have an extra low string because a lot of times there's not bass there, and a lot of times they do that to the bandolim there too, which is their mandolin instrument, a little bigger body, but same tuning system, just like a fretted fiddle, but they put a low C on it. So that's where it's coming from. And I had I've had a relationship with a great luthier for over 20 years with John Buscarino, who's just a master luthier of the highest order. I'm honored to play his instruments, and I have 4 of them. 2 of which are arch tops, and 1 of which is a flat top, and 1 of which is like a steel string acoustic, and the other is just my kind of good old workhorse electric guitar. It can do everything from Nashville to shredder to funk, anything in between, and I even do jazz gigs on it. But they're all 7 strings because I'm often in that situation where I'm playing where I have to fill out a lot of what would be there, and I will still use it when I'm in a larger ensemble. I just tend to not, it's like a bass player not using his low C extension. But yeah, it's there if you need it. If you're playing the big Beethoven, you need that low C, and you can let it rip. But if you don't need it, you can just ignore it. So that's kind of what I use a lot, or actually primarily. So it just adds a little bit of dimension to that, and it's maybe a style I've developed a little more over the years, and that's tried to be maybe a little more pianistic rather than a block chord kind of approach to solo guitar playing. I've tried to make it more contrapuntal, more pianistic in ways that I fill the space, not so vertically.
Watching you play, and the choreography, your left-hand choreography, is really something to behold. I imagine that took a lot of just trial and error, just trying to figure out how to do that. Literally, that I owe a lot of that to just, I just can't say how much you learn on the bandstand by doing that and trying things out. And there's just not enough hours in the day to practice reacting to something. It's really hard music to practice in certain ways, especially when you're playing solo, because there's nothing to react to. And not that I don't practice, but when I practice, I'm trying to refine my strengths and laser focus on my weaknesses. We were playing like four probably times a week, usually 4 or 5 nights a week, doing stuff like this. 3-4 hour gigs. That's interesting. There was I was listening to interview. Unfortunately, I can't remember her name. She's a prominent chef, and before she hit it big with her own restaurant in Manhattan or New York City somewhere, she was working like brunches. And so it was all very incredibly repetitive. And so she would challenge herself to do all right, I'm going to do this with no crumbs. It sounds a little bit similar where you're taking this kind of repetitive gig and you're using the time very wisely to practice and challenge yourself to try new things.
And trying to cloak that practice musically, because you don't want to practice on the bandstand, but you want to try stuff because you're not going to have another chance to do it. And we are playing kind of the same book a lot, we play different stuff, but it's always different versions of similar repertoire, so that becomes really challenging. And over the years, I've I always had a draw towards classical guitar, definitely, because it's in a similar vein. It's a solo instrument, so it's similar to that, but like a solo jazz guitar. And playing the fingerstyle thing was a natural fit for that because bass and melody can be separated naturally, as opposed to playing plectrum or pick style, where you have to plug the chord all at the same time. So that's what I mean, trying to break away from maybe a block chord style. So I was always into that, trying to play with independence, try to have a bass line moving and then a melody counter to that. And where there's space in the melody, I can try to fit some chordal commentary in between that on the middle string sets, and I try to develop what became, especially playing with a vocalist, more of a stride style maybe on the guitar for doing that in a jazz setting, and I'll have different tempos that I know what's possible for certain things. And I have different gears I can go into, walking bass lines versus playing in a 2-feel versus playing, rubato verses, which are always challenging to, so just over the years, that's been incredible playing with her, because I've been able to develop, both of us, been able to develop our style so much. And we were both, of course, working on it far before when we came together to do that, but it's given us the opportunity to work on that more and become better artists at what we do. And then, there's this whole other side of things, interests that both of us have, coming from a rock and blues and funk, and with her, a lot of soul and R&B kind of music and stuff too. As great as a jazz singer she is, her strength and her range can really shine in that style. And, I had a blast playing I have a blast playing in that band. And where you're just kind of playing a part, it's again back to what I was saying about Andy Summers or players like that, or George Harrison. It's like they're thinking about the pop craft of coming up with a perfect part. You basically have a chart in the studio, or you just know the tune. But there's not a guitar part. There's chords, you know what the chords are, but you can't just sit there and chunk chords four to a bar all the time. You got to come up with something creative. So that's where I can use improvisational process and then keep what my best ideas are. And then that becomes the way I play a song. So that ties into playing a completely different thing, but using that jazz background to do so.
My impression of your work in her band is that the band itself and the music too can absorb almost as much virtuosity as you can bring to it. It's a really great platform for you, because you can really lay back, but you can really approach the same sort of figures from different angles, and it really adds a lot of texture to the music, where that probably wouldn't be able to exist in a more straight ahead rock band.
Yeah, because the parts, and it shouldn't, because I think it would detract from the overall musicality of it. There's a certain reason why that format needs to be that way, but yeah, certainly playing in a duo setting too. The band is kind of is happening as you are.
Yeah, no, you guys, it's an amazing record. I'll link to it. You guys sound fantastic. Tell me a little bit about your experiences playing with orchestras.
Really, prior to when Teddy was here, it was limited to more the Pops gigs, when they would come around. I'd play with Indianapolis sometimes, or Cincinnati, or strangely not so much in Louisville at the time. But my first experience with it, other than playing it's jazz Christmas at the Pops kind of those kind of shows or something, and those are always fun. Or they need a rock guitar solo on one piece of the set. But for playing more serious music with it, where it was more integral to the texture of everything, I have a great friend named Tim Behrens, who is a conductor and guitarist and arranger for the Cincinnati Pops, and has been for years. He's played with Cincinnati Pops probably about 30 years, I guess, since when Eric Counsel was still the conductor. And he was, Maestro Kunzel's kind of go-to guy for all the guitar stuff. And then he started writing arrangements for them, because they knew he could write arrangements. So he's kind of a quadruple threat, really, because he's a great classical player, classical guitarist, plays great jazz guitar, rock guitar, blues guitar. he's just that like utility guy that does anything on the instrument on top of having all this vast musical training, and ability beyond the guitar. So he made this crazy arrangement for 2 guitars and orchestra for Rhapsody in Blue, but it was for 2 guitars, and I was the left hand and he was the right hand. And all the all those 2-hand hocketing kind of piano things that we're working, all these polyrhythms that Gershwin had written in the piano score. I mean, it was a brilliant, it's so musical the way it works. And we're up there playing 2 arch tops. He's got like his Gibson L5. I got my Buscarino. And then specifically with the 7-string, because it has the range of piano. And man, we got to perform that a lot. And at this time, I knew nothing about pops orchestras or orchestras in general. This was my first time playing with it. And I guess we played, it was with Eric Counsel, and, I had no idea who he was, or I'm kind of glad at the time, because I think I would have been a lot more nervous. But, I realized how many records, great crossover conductors, sold tons of stuff on Telarc and everything, and in that Arthur Fiedler kind of tradition. But he was really generous enough on the program to give us space to do Tim's arrangements, and I was featured on those as we played Rhapsody in Blue with the orchestra. And the great thing about his arrangement was that the orchestra didn't have to do anything different. It totally changed. The cadenzas were in the same place. The music was the same pacing, everything. It just got 2 guitars playing instead of piano. So that was so much fun. So we got to play with him in Cincinnati and in Indianapolis a couple times. Played it up in Windsor, Canada, and Detroit, and with their more recent conductor, John Morris Russell. So, we got to do that a lot, and that was a very great experience for me, just being a soloist with an orchestra. You guys get to do that all the time, but some redneck guitar player with 80 people playing behind him, they feel like a big shot, man. It's pretty cool. I guess the adjustment coming from what I do, it's more about the where and the when than the what, I guess, because we never follow conductors. It's all strict tempo music is what I grew up. It's all about pocket. It's all about time feel and laying back or being a little bit ahead, knowing when to be in the middle of the beat and back of the beat, backside of the beat, at the beat. So, I knew what to play. I knew how to play it, but the whole, just the artistry of shaping a phrase as a whole large ensemble, and then being at the point of the spear of that when you're the soloist in front of an orchestra, man, that was a super big just learning experience for me, and just awakening. And, realizing on that side of things how intuitive that is for you guys, playing it in orchestral music all the time at this point, and really how little thought it's done, of course, intuitively, but how little thought is actually given, sadly, to articulation, shape for phrase shaping, dynamics in anything other than feeling the moment. But when we're practicing, as jazz artists, maybe, you all see 5 notes, you see 17 different possibilities for articulations. We just see 5 notes and it's like, yeah, I'll just play it how but there's not the same kind of, it's going to change depending on who you're playing it with, and so we never really, and I found myself never really falling into this way of practicing, which I have since, but up until then of really taking that seriously as a guitar player. And I know that's, nothing for someone coming from, that's your bread and butter as a classical instrumentalist. But so little of that, if you even see a big band chart, so many classical musicians are so frustrated when if they're doubling in one of those ensembles, especially in the brass people. It's literally no articulations, 0 dynamics. It's a big 20-piece ensemble piece written, and there's not a single articulation, because so much of it is just idiomatic to the style. And if you're not familiar with that style, you're not going to phrase it right. But it would be a jazz guy coming in and trying to play a Viennese waltz correctly, with the and just playing it like an oompa. And, everything I do would sound like a polka because I'm just reading what's on the page. And then Teddy came to town, and, I learned of him through Will Oldham, or who, as he's known, as his nom de plume, Bonnie Prince Billy, the great musical artist, amazing songwriter and performer. And he was like, hey, we're doing this thing at the Faulkner Gallery with this great new wonderkind orchestra conductor for the LO that's coming. Would you like to be part of this? And I was like, absolutely. When is it? And so we played down there, and it was, this amazing set. I think we played an Everly Brothers tune, and played, and Teddy's playing piano and I'm playing guitar. There's no bass player, and it's like, I think Cheyenne Mize was playing fiddle, and Will was singing, and it was awesome energy. And I was like, my God, and then Teddy did this elaborate improvisation in the beginning of the set, and I was like, man, this guy's got something going on. This is amazing. But I just saw his breadth as a performer, and as just a musician in general. And then LO had called me for him to get me to do the Bernstein's Mass. And we played, that's probably the first full thing I played with the LO. And that, is a great 2-guitar book, and got to meet our mutual friend, Derek Johnson. The amazing Derek Johnson was on guitar, who also plays with Bang on a Can and many other ensembles. He's a great guitar player. So that was a really fun piece to be involved with. And then ever since then, I've kind of been called for most of the things that have been, used that he's needed guitar on, and such as some of his own pieces like Unified Field, which was like a really
that was the one I was referencing earlier on. I thought that was the first time I heard you play. I mean, yeah, learning something like that. I mean, what kind of time frame are we talking about for putting something like that together?
I guess I got that about 2 weeks ahead of time, I think. So it wasn't a lot. I mean, I'll have to say a lot of that stuff is not very guitaristic, and it's very musical, but it doesn't. There wasn't a natural fingering for a lot of things, and so I had to get really creative with. And I didn't want to sacrifice any of the notes because all the writing was brilliant and everything was on the page. So I had to find a way to approach that music. It's a great challenge, and we ended up recording that as you did with the LO on, what was it, All In. But yeah, that was something to get together, and it's at a pretty fast clip, and a lot of metric modulations and little landmines to avoid there. From that, I guess he was playing that at the Brit Festival, his piece, and something happened with one of the guitar players up there, and they were about to not be able to play the piece, and he kind of called me at the last minute. But there's also this other piece by Michael Tilson Thomas, who was, of course, whom he was a student of and protege of. And they were performing one of MTT's pieces, which was Playthings of the Wind, his adaptation of the great Carl Sandburg poem. So I had to it was like 2 rehearsals that already happened, and they had to, the guitar player had to get rid of, and I was already 2 rehearsals down, and we were coming in for 1 rehearsal and a dress rehearsal, and crazy hard piece I hadn't played in 6 months, and then this totally brand new piece of music, and which was equally foreign. And I just kind of had to learn them on the plane, because he called me while we were on vacation, and so it was literally next day I was on a plane out to Oregon to play at this festival. It was a great performance. It was really fun to do those. So through that, I kept getting the call from Michael Tilson Thomas to, whenever he performed this piece, to be part of that piece. And I've then insanely gotten to play with the LA Phil and the Philadelphia, and play with the New World Symphony several times, and got to play at Carnegie Hall, the Kimmel Center, the Frank Gehry building. Sadly, last week we were literally supposed to play with this same piece with Chicago, but the whole season was called off, so that's been postponed. And we're booked in 2022 to play it at the Kennedy Center with the National Orchestra. So I can't believe, just coming from my, what I do, getting to play with I have to pinch myself. Sometimes I'm on stage and I should be nervous, but I'm just so excited. It's just so much fun. It's like, I can't believe, like, man.
Yeah,
Look
I
at
mean,
that.
it's an amazing trajectory that you've been on for like this contemporary music guitarist.
Yeah.
Both you and Derek.
Oh, Derek, man, I can't say enough things about it. And how
It's,
much I've learned from him as being part of that. If you all don't know him, man, what a heavyweight he is in so many ways. And just honestly, listening to some of the stuff he did, especially those Steve Reich pieces that he was playing with Bang on a Can, and just realizing the strength of a lot of new music out there. We're talking about composers who grew up with a completely different set of musical influences than their generation or two prior to them, and so guitar figures heavily in that.
yeah, the flip side of that, listening to you talk about the things you absorb from playing with orchestras and the different approaches to articulation and things. I want to say the flip side of this relationship, from my perspective, is that it's given me an insight into how much subtlety there is in the way you guys think about rhythm. We are so obsessed with how things like quote unquote sound that
Right.
we'll fudge the rhythm to make that happen at any cost.
Yeah.
But like
Right.
there is something confusing about, as a listener, I think, about listening to something that doesn't have like a really defined sense of steady rhythm. And not to say that like a Wagner overture or something needs like a drum set, but playing with people that have a drum set or drummers like set, right, like a drummer's like sense of rhythm has been really eye-opening for me as a musician.
Well, I'm seeing a lot of those barriers between those two sides of thinking dissolve so much with younger classical musicians, coming out of conservatories. It seems like just their frame of reference is different, and there's more of a frame of mind they come with, that they kind of have a more rhythmic understanding, and maybe not the jazz stuff, but maybe at least strict tempo styles, and knowing just the intuitive side of that, which is so hard to truly notate.
Kind of like we were saying a little while ago about the access to music and how much different styles and different approaches to music that younger players absorb. I certainly felt this trend was in motion when I was in college. Except those people are now, that I went to college with, are now professors, right? And so that the trend has accelerated to the point where there are no real barriers between young performers and young composers across styles. And I mean, we were talking about this stuff 20 years ago, but but now it's like really in practice. And I wonder if these worlds will kind of coalesce a little bit, and we'll take what is important, what is valuable from each other, and blend it into something that benefits listeners.
I would hope so, because I mean, I think there's so much there to mine from in the the collaboration of those two efforts, and then not even seeing them as two different styles, really. I mean, just seeing them as all part of the same continuum. In each camp, so to speak, having like a wider frame of reference. I know that should go for the jazz players, and having a wider knowledge of classical music, and especially more new music, and just how much of it really speaks to what they do, and what their strengths actually are, and not feeling closed off from that. I mean, as a guitar player, you definitely feel closed off from all the classics. I mean, there's no place for you in any of that. There was never a place for me as a guitar player in any academic group growing up. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a shame, because I think I could have added something to that, and it would have shaved a couple years off my development. And you know what I mean? But there's no. It's like, oh, I'm sorry, you can't play guitar. Here's a trumpet. It's like, I want to play trumpet. I want to play guitar. It's like, but there's no outlet for that kind of thing in that kind of sense. I think that's a shame, because I think there's a lot of great musical talent out there that maybe couldn't be, that could be tapped into if they were able to combine those efforts a little more, certainly in school. And most definitely, it's already happening in the professional world, as we're both mentioning. But I think the big place for it is just starting that early on and not making those divisions between the styles of music. And I think that is as much the fault of like maybe jazz education as it is the classical, Eurocentric kind of, typical kind of conservatory education that had preceded before these times, because we see that changing obviously now. But, I think there's a certain entrenchment in the jazz pedagogy, as it were, as much as there is to blame on the other side too. Mm-hmm. So, but what I really love is seeing those boundaries really dissolve. As we were mentioning earlier, with like so much crossover with maybe bluegrass and jazz and things of that nature, and rock and jazz, and so many hybridizations of these improvised styles and American folkish styles that kind of grew to this point of sophistication. They became these really virtuosic styles. I don't see anything really separating that from happening with the classical world and all of those as well.
I think that just as communicators, musically or just as interpersonally, I think of somebody like a Wynton Marsalis who couldn't possibly be the person he is if he didn't have like his feet in so many different genres and style. And I mean, he's such an intellectually curious person anyway. Yeah, but you think like, why is he maybe the greatest ambassador for music, but maybe in particular for American music? And it's because like this combining things, reinterpretation, making the idea of improvisation as a metaphor for democracy. And like these guys, like these are like truly American, this is truly American music. And any American musician that doesn't have like, well, so what Teddy says, at least be able to play it with respect. Like you might not even be, it makes you like a more full person, more full musician, and a more full communicator.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree with that more.
Look, man, this is probably a good place to wrap this up. I really appreciate your taking time to talk through your career with me.
I'm so honored to be here. Thanks so much, Robert. This has been great.
And of course, your music is our theme song for this podcast. And so we will link to many of the highlights of your many activities. And again, thank you for your time, Craig. Thank you for listening. Again, the music on the show is by this episode's guest, Craig Wagner. So many thanks to him. We'll be back in early January 2021 with a conversation with violinist Alana Tenetti-Tiepo, an American violinist in the Royal Northern Symphonia in England. So please go ahead and hit subscribe.